while we was on the break, you were talking about Mike Bobo in college. You want to tell everybody what you were telling me before the break? Yeah, I lived through the Bobo Rick years as a fan. I mean, and it's a bit hard to accept Mike Bobo to lead this offense after having watched how he's performed. But Bobo, starting back in college, he defies physics. Bobo shouldn't exist, but he exists. Well, what do you mean he shouldn't exist? Well, I mean, the Bobo that we know, the stats, the accomplishments, everything that constitutes what Mike Bobo is and was, doesn't make any sense. It shouldn't exist. But yet, we see him in the flesh. He does exist, but he shouldn't. I mean, for example, even starting in college, Bobo's teams, he had about 3 years, and they were very consistent. The same thing for 3 years, and those consistent things were slow starts, inconsistent offense, and severe red zone issues. But he averages 40 points a game and is explosive at times and sometimes not. And so you just can't put that together. There's a disconnect between the elements that Bobo represents. I mean, how many coaches would have slow starts? How many coaches or players would have slow starts as a characteristic? It never has failed. He's been very consistent. His teams don't score early, and they're always inconsistent, and always, most every game, explosive at times. The fact that you can be explosive and yet not be explosive more than you are. It's a disconnect into the dynamics of what Bobo represents, and that's why he's been a fascinating study. More fascinating when he's not your coordinator, but fascinating nonetheless. And I don't understand why Kirby Smart went that route. Here he was, Todd Monken, at the height of anything Georgia's ever had in history, the highest point they could have possibly imagined. I mean, back-to-back national titles after having to listen to 1980 talk, and then it seemed to have come together. And it was definitely, Todd Monken was a big part of that happening. Surely Kirby Smart had to know that this offensive coordinator change when Monken went to the NFL was important, and there was no national search, and it did seem as if he'd already had the solution before the problem occurred. Yeah, I don't know. I don't make it my duty to get into the mind of what a head coach might be thinking, or not second guessing. I did find it odd that Kirby went that route. I find it odd, but when you really know Georgia history, it's not as odd as it might seem on the surface. We'll get more on that later. It's the Georgia culture. The Georgia culture is part of why Mike Bobo works well here at Georgia. And you'll notice that he didn't stick around very long anywhere else. Well, I mean, that's understandable. He simply didn't help any of the other teams, South Carolina and Auburn. There was no success to speak of. There were also reasons to explain that, and it just became a blurry mess. But he certainly didn't find any homes in South Carolina and Auburn. No, and it's not to be expected because those cultures are different. You can't go to a like in South Carolina, the head coach is under the gun. They're almost on a hot seat. Bring in a coordinator and have him perform like he did with Georgia. These same problems occur. Slow starts, lack of consistency, and of course, some success. It's a baffling arrangement of assets with Mike Bobo, but a struggling school, uh, they can't afford that kind of production drop off. And but a place like Georgia, where they have the skill talent, is probably better. Um, it seems like Mike Bobo has found a home, and Georgia might be the only place he would ever work. Not saying that it's worked, because in my opinion it has not worked, even in college. It was baffling that he kept the starting job with the interceptions and the fact that he did not win the big games. But he won enough, and it seemed like the fans were always led on to expect big things. This is when he was in college. Looked at as a premier quarterback. Everybody in the nation gave him a lot of credit because he had a lot of talent, and in many games would actually be dazzling. That doesn't mean they won the games, and he wasn't dazzling the whole game. And so I think after studying Mike Bobo as long as I have, I think I've come up with something that does make it make sense. And it's the only thing that makes Mike Bobo make sense. Physics can be possibly restored. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Well, Frank, you talked a lot about Georgia culture. What basically has formed Georgia's culture as we know it right now? Well, Georgia football has always cheated its fans of many possible championships, many trophies they could have had lie elsewhere. And there's a dark alley that Mike Bobo operates in tandem with Georgia's history. That history is conservative play, manage the clock, and physical football. That seems to be a part of Georgia's football culture. And you can go back to Vince Dooley. Go back to Vince Dooley in '64. He changed Georgia's culture because, quite frankly, it didn't have one. Not really. It was second banana to Georgia Tech back in the 50s, early 60s. They were basically a floundering program and never had really developed a lot of culture. It also coincided with the expansion of college football to the major country. It became a national sport in the late 60s and 70s, became a television game. And most of the cultures you see today sort of formed in that time frame. Same is true with Georgia. Vince Dooley basically decided Georgia's culture. And it's been a continuation of the Vince Dooley culture up until today. The only exception to that attitude was 21 and 22, and they won national titles when they discarded their cultural identity of being a conservative run team, physical, and they didn't like to pass. Basically, Vince Dooley did not like to pass the football, which became a real impediment as football became a passing game. The game passed Georgia by. In 1971, Vince Dooley recruited Horace King, Richard Appleby, Gene Washington. Those were all out of Athens, Georgia. It was the year after they desegregated the high schools, and all those I mentioned were from the black high school, Bernie Harris in Athens, and they actually they played a game with the crosstown rival Athens High, and they beat them pretty bad, or at least for a few quarters. Miraculously, I think somehow Athens High came back. But they displayed some amazing physical skills in that game, and of course in the whole season. Horace King, Richard Appleby, and Gene Washington. Gene Washington wasn't from Bernie Harris, but those were three players that Vince Dooley had on his team in 1971. That team went 11-1, but they did not beat Auburn. And Auburn was a passing team, a Heisman Trophy winner for Auburn, and Georgia lost 35-20. And they couldn't throw the ball that well, and when you're down 35-20, well, the only way to come back is having explosive play. And pretty hard to get explosive plays when you run the ball against a team that can stop the run. But those players were available, they were eligible, they'd already had their, at that time, freshmen couldn't play. They were eligible. Richard Appleby, Gene Washington, Horace King were all on that sideline when Georgia lost the only game that mattered that year to them, and they didn't play that much. Richard Appleby and Washington became a legend in Georgia lore for winning the Florida game a couple of years later with a Appleby to Washington pass, a little flea flicker. So they only used them occasionally, a trick play here and there. Appleby was a dazzling quarterback who could throw it a mile, he could run, remind you of Deshaun Watson. Horace King, a sturdy running back, lots of speed. Wasn't quite a Herschel Walker, but he was used a bit, but not as much as you would like. But he's a running back, so he's only one of those three that got any playing time. I don't think Richard Appleby played much at all the entire time he was at Georgia. A very capable quarterback. Those kind of things can't be explained. So it comes down to the fact that Georgia has probably wasted more great talent than probably any school that we can think of. So then you have this conservative culture, and then Mike Bobo shows up, and we talked about the dark alleys that he operates out of. He operated out of those dark alleys in college, and that's where we got the theory that made Mike Bobo make sense. Mike Bobo makes sense. Slow starts, inconsistent play, red zone inefficiencies will do one thing. And what do you think that is? Well, it sounds like it slowed scoring down quite a bit. Absolutely. If your fan bases get expecting slow starts, inconsistent play, red zone inefficiencies become part of your personality as a team, and you go back and look at how many great kickers Georgia's had. So many famous Larry Munson calls involving kicks. Kevin Butler, the great field goal kicker, was our leading scorer, possibly even during the Herschel years. So Georgia is a perfect place to do what Mike Bobo seems to be doing. What exactly is he doing? Well, we took the trouble, and last year I did this personally, is that before the game, every game last year, I always look at the spread and all that, but I wrote down the Vegas total, which is the total points scored in the game. And I wrote that down and I counted the points at the end of the game, and I found out that 10 times last year, that score was lower than the Vegas total, which means the over-under was met. You would have won a bet. Had you bet on the under with Georgia, you would have won 10 times last year. And it seems to be a pattern with Mike Bobo. All his years at Georgia, those numbers are consistent, just like the style of play. And so what does that imply? It doesn't imply anything. It simply is a fact. You can use your imagination as to how that might be used. I can tell you that the way Vegas operates, betting on the over-under isn't everybody's favorite bet. You get your money back even. There's hardly ever any more than that. In fact, a lot of times if you bet 1,000, you might make 900. Not the kind of bet that the average bettor likes to engage in. But if you're deciding half the score, and you have some connections to be able to profit from this, which is certainly not unimaginable that could happen, and no coach would have to ever turn on the betting app. But the arrangements could be made very easily if the results were guaranteed. You create a sure thing in Vegas, and somebody's going to bank it, provide the platform. So think about what if you could put a huge amount of money, knowing that you control half the score, and you got a program that's not going to fire you when you lose big games. It's a gold mine. All we're saying is that all those things are in place. You'll never be able to catch this guy. If that's what he's doing, it's a perfect scam. And Georgia is a perfect place to run the scam. And he ran it for 7 years with Mike Bobo. Those stats he turned in would never have been accepted anywhere else in the country. But they were here, and in fact, they were applauded. And they're still doing it. Georgia's culture is its own enemy.